Hi, welcome to another episode of Susie Reads. We're continuing our adventure of witches, ghosts, and goblins. We've certainly met the goblins, and we just finished meeting the ghosts. Polly and the imp just left Ghost Valley, and they were successful in getting the crown that had been stolen from the king of the goblins so many years ago. But now they have to get it safely back to the Goblin King. Will they be successful? Let's read and find out. Chapter 12, Return from Ghost Valley. Strangely enough, no one can leave Ghost Valley the same way that one came in. Even magic broomsticks must take another course because of the tricky crosswinds that rush from the canyons. Polly and the imp have a different flight pattern on the way back to the land of the goblins. It is much more dangerous. For one thing, the air path goes directly above Witch City, the capital city of the witches. Broomsticks flown by unlicensed pilots will undoubtedly be reported to headquarters. There may be trouble. Moreover, there are the mountains of the moon, tall, towering, treacherous peaks that must be crossed, and a long stretch of black space that makes the flyer feel like he is sailing through midnight for hour on hour in a starless, soundless sky. But there are things at work on behalf of Polly and the imp. By now, the broomstick and the imp are getting along well together. Polly is clever, and she will be watching left and right, front and back, for any possible trouble. But let's face it, the trip is not an easy one. The return from Ghost Valley. Early the next morning, Miranda informed the guards that Polly and the imp were on their way back to the land of the goblins. "I think you should tell the king," she said. "Now run along." Very soon after, to the great surprise of both Miranda and Oliver, the king immediately summoned them to his private quarters. The apartment was quite cozy and cheerful compared to the grandeur of the throne room. A fire burned briskly in the huge fireplace. On the hearth were the two golden-colored cats that Miranda and Oliver had seen in the throne room. The cats stretched lazily and gazed at the two newcomers suspiciously, much the same as the king was looking at them. "Such lovely cats," Miranda complimented the king. "I suppose you've had no reports about my poor lost cactus." "No," the king answered, "but I have had a report from the guards that Polly and the imp are on their way back from Ghost Valley. Is that correct?" "Of course," Miranda answered. "I never lie. I am a good witch." The king snorted. "How do you know they are returning?" "Magic," replied Miranda. She would explain no further. "Was the mission successful?" the king queried. "Are they bringing back the crown?" Miranda smiled sweetly. "Even a king shouldn't know everything," she told him. "However, if you and the royal court are there to meet Polly and the imp when they land in the royal garden, I do think there may be cause for a celebration." It was the king's turn to smile. A vision of the golden crown with all of its fabulous jewels flashed before his eyes. "What time will they be landing?" he asked. Miranda rummaged in her owl-shaped bag and brought forth a rather battered watch. She looked at it carefully, closed her eyes, and counted to 10. Then, giving the watch a bit of a shake, she consulted it again. "Polly and the imp will arrive precisely at 37 minutes past 11. "Splendid," the king said. "I shall assemble the royal court in the royal garden, and we shall have a royal picnic in honor of the event." On the way back to their apartment, Miranda turned to Oliver. "I wonder what quest the king has in mind for me," she mused. "After all, He has said all along that I too will be tested. I am still worrying about Polly and the imp way up in the sky on that broomstick, Oliver replied. Do you think the imp is really a good broomstick pilot? Well, he doesn't have a license, but have no fear, Miranda. Miranda fingered a little radio that she always wore around her neck. I'm in touch, and the latest report is that all goes well and they are on schedule. Back in their apartment, Oliver and Miranda made ready for the royal picnic. I think, Oliver, you should write a welcome speech for Polly and the imp. Include a few compliments to the king. If I fail my task, we'll need a lot of nice words to get us out of this place. Oliver concentrated on a welcome speech. Now and then, Miranda would listen to her little radio and interrupt his thoughts with announcements. Listen to this. Polly and the imp were just seen successfully passing the mountains of the moon. Polly is wearing a beautiful crown. The imp has on a diamond tie pin. Oliver glanced at Miranda and smiled. How far from here are the mountains of the moon? Miranda held up her hand and silenced him. She listened intently to her radio. Polly and the imp have been spotted by 2 unidentified witches riding broomsticks. The unidentified flying witches are following them. Oliver looked alarmed. Bother! Miranda exclaimed, just when things were going so very well. She twirled around 3 times and staggered slightly, and gazing out the window toward the sky, recited, Broomstick, broomstick, out in space, you must win the witch's race. Broomstick, broomstick, trusted steed, now's the time to put on speed. Both Oliver and Miranda waited in silence for several minutes. Then Miranda consulted her radio again. She listened intently and repeated to Oliver what she had heard. Latest report. Polly and the imp, in a sudden burst of speed, have left the flying witches far behind. The witches appear to have given up the chase. Broomstick is back on course and on schedule. Prepare for a landing party at 11:37. With a sigh of relief, Oliver returned to his speech. Good broomstick, Miranda said softly to herself. Then, turning to Oliver, she went on, Look, the royal guests are arriving in the garden. It must be nearly time for the landing. With a fanfare of trumpets, the king of the goblins arrived in the royal garden just as Miranda and Oliver joined the crowd. Everyone looked skyward, but so far there was no sign of the approaching travelers. It was 24 minutes past 11. The sun shone brightly, and the crystal flowers glittered in the warm sunshine. They couldn't ask for better flying weather, the king stated in a loud voice as he checked his jeweled platinum watch. At 32 minutes past 11, Oliver cried out in excitement, There! Just over the golden dome of the great palace! I see something in the sky! All eyes turned to where he was pointing. The speck grew larger and larger until one could see it was a broomstick with 2 figures astride. Precisely at 37 minutes past 11, Polly and the imp at the controls of the broomstick swooped down on the emerald green lawn in a perfect landing. There was applause from the crowd. As the king stepped forward to greet the new arrivals, his gaze was so riveted on the dazzling crown Polly was wearing that he nearly tripped over a small ruby rose bush. The crowd held its breath until the king regained his balance. When kings fall, dreadful things can happen. Before the king had quite recovered himself, Miranda pushed Oliver forward. Now, say your piece before he catches his breath, Miranda directed. Oliver unrolled the paper on which he had written his speech and read aloud in a clear voice. To our brave and daring travelers who have returned safely from Ghost Valleys, Congratulations and welcome back to this beautiful land of the goblins, which is ruled by a wise and noble king." Miranda smiled, and the king nodded his head approvingly. Oliver continued, "We, your fellow prisoners, are particularly pleased to see that you have accomplished your mission with success. We join you in hoping that the great and good king of the goblins will now direct his subjects to start the search for our beloved friend's cat Cactus, even before Miranda has completed the final quest as directed by the king." Oliver bowed low. Before the king could respond, Polly removed the crown from her head, stepping forward, presenting it to the king. "Your gracious majesty," she said simply, "the imp and I return in the most beautiful crown in the world to its rightful owner, the king of the goblins." Only Miranda saw the imp quickly remove his diamond tie pin and hide it in his pocket. "Dear imp," Miranda commanded, "it is your turn to give a gift to the king." The imp fidgeted and gave Miranda an angry look. Slowly, the imp walked forward. He reached into his pocket and brought forth the diamond tie pin, which he had hoped to keep for himself. "For your majesty," he said, presenting to him the glittering pin. "Perhaps you can award it to whoever finds Miranda's cat." The king of the goblins removed his old crown and handed it to an attendant, who placed it on a velvet pillow he was carrying. Then the king put the world's most beautiful crown on his head. The crowd cheered. The king beamed. Miranda did a little jig to show how happy she was, and the imp joined her. The king clapped his hands sharply, and scores of servants appeared, laden with baskets of food. "In celebration, we shall have a royal picnic. We wish to express our gratitude for the successful completion of 2 missions, and our royal hope that the 3rd mission will also be successful." He directed a long look at Miranda. "Now, let there be food. Let there be music, and let there be rejoicing." It was indeed a gala occasion. The imp ate far too much and promptly fell fast asleep under an amethyst bush. Polly and Oliver joined the royal court in a square dance. Miranda waltzed around and around with the king, all while the court stood in a circle watching. They applauded when the dancing stopped. "My," Miranda gasped, "I'm quite out of breath." She leaned against a statue while Polly fanned her. "I'd be quite happy," she told Polly, "if only Cactus were here." She looked at the king, who was talking earnestly with his court counselor. And if only, Miranda continued, "my quest, whatever it is, were successfully completed." Just then, the king held up his hand for attention. The music stopped. The crowd became silent. "First, I have an announcement," he stated. "I now decree that goblins everywhere will begin a search for Cactus, Miranda's cat." He turned to Miranda. "Can you furnish us with a description, my dear?" Miranda stepped forward. "Cactus is the most beautiful black cat in the world. She has green eyes, and if you say to her, 'Cactus, Cactus, jump,' she will leap on your shoulder and curl her tail around your neck. Moreover, she can ride on a broomstick and even guide it if necessary." From her owl-shaped bag, in which she was rummaging, Miranda pulled forth a framed picture. "This is Cactus." She held it aloft, then turned to the king. "Perhaps you can have many prints made of this photograph and distributed throughout your kingdom." The king nodded in agreement. Miranda wiped away a tear. "I do miss Cactus so much," she said. The king nodded sympathetically. "And now, Miranda, it is time to proclaim your test." Miranda walked forward and stood before the king. Oliver nudged the imp. awake, and he followed her behind them. Behind them stood Polly and Oliver. "It's really quite simple," the king said, Miranda. "I have always wanted a broomstick of my own on which to sail through the air. I command you to go to which city and bring me back a broomstick. Any old broomstick will do," he added, "only, of course, it must be airworthy." Miranda paled. "But there are only as many broomsticks as there are witches," she told him. "I am quite sure," the king stated, "that Demona, the queen of the witches, must have several. Perhaps you can borrow one from her?" "We shall await your return with eagerness. Oliver and Polly remain here, of course. Good luck." The king and the royal court filed their way past the crystal flowers and the statues and across the emerald lawns. The servants and the musicians followed them. Miranda, Polly, Oliver, and the imp were left alone. With a shrug of her shoulders, Miranda turned to the imp. "Well, my little friend, what are we waiting for?" The imp smiled weakly. "Demona is a wicked queen," he said. "If she has an extra broomstick, she will never part with it. Furthermore, she hates goblins." He shivered slightly. "And she doesn't trust brownies either. We're doomed to failure before we even start." Miranda looked grim. For that matter, Demona is not fond at all of good witches. She marched over to the broomstick and climbed aboard. "However," Miranda addressed them all, "where there's a will, there's a way. Right makes might, and I am determined that there shall be every opportunity to find Cactus." She beckoned to the imp. "Climb aboard, my friend." Oliver and Polly watched as the two travelers prepared for takeoff. "Good luck," Polly called. "You'll succeed," Oliver said. "You and the imp are the best team yet. You have your magic." Miranda and the imp waved to them, and they whooshed and they were off. Polly and Oliver, hand in hand, stood in the glittering garden, which now seemed strangely empty. The broomstick with its two passengers became smaller and smaller until it was only a little dot against the early sunset. "Where is which city?" Oliver queried. "You're asking me," Polly replied. She smiled. "I'm sure Miranda knows the way." "I wish I were sure that she'll win out against Queen Demona," Oliver returned. "Sometimes she does get a little rattled." Slowly, the two of them walked back to their apartment. The guards saluted them and smiled. "I have the feeling," Polly said, "that everyone is hoping for the best." Oliver nodded. "Even the king of the goblins," he said. And that is the end of chapter 12. We're getting close to the end. Only a few more chapters. Will Miranda and the imp succeed? Will they get a broomstick for the king of the goblins? And what if they don't? Does that mean they stay captives of the king of the goblins forever? Guess we'll have to continue our journey next time on Susie Reads. See you later.